Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have a few people here with us live and then more who will be watching the recorded version of this at some point in the future. And welcome to all of you. We are here today for our neuro-based toolbox to help kids manage their behavior and emotions. I've loved creating this course and I hope that you find it interesting and exciting too. As a therapist, it's always kind of bugged me when I'm doing something like midline crossing activities and I want to know, why does it work and are we sure that it works, And so in this course we're going to be diving deep into research to see how these strategies really impact the brain, or if they impact the brain. Sometimes we're going to find out there really isn't evidence showing us that these strategies, some of the strategies that we've used for forever, aren't well supported in the evidence. So we'll talk about what that means too. So we're really going to be looking in depth at the brain and at neurotransmitters and strategies. Okay, today's sections, or session one, is mostly going to be looking on the brain structures, and hopefully you find that fun. I'm a neuro geek myself and I love all of that. To make it a little bit easier for you to stay involved and to have something to refer back to, I have created this brain coloring page that all of you hopefully have printed out from the course materials section. And I'll be guiding you through this as we add to it throughout this lecture today. But if you want to grab a box of colored pencils or crayons to have handy to allow you to add some coloring to this brain sheet, then that might be helpful for you. So go ahead and grab those if you want to take a minute to do so while I'm going over this introduction. My name is Gwen Wild. I am an occupational therapist and I am also the owner of Sensational Brain. And most of you are probably familiar with our website, and that's what has brought you to us today, and I'm glad to have you here. This is a slide that basically says some things that are presented in this course may be outside the scope of your profession, and that's true for all of us. We always want to know when we get to the end of what we're comfortable addressing and when to refer out. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, self-regulation in general, falls under a lot of different professional umbrellas. We as occupational therapists address self-regulation. We do it often through looking at the brain-body connection. Physical therapists play a role in making sure that the physical systems are working as they should to give kids what they need. People in the mental health professions like counselors and psychologists and social workers definitely play a big role in helping kids develop self-regulation skills. And teachers and parents, absolutely. You're the ones doing life with kids and play the biggest role in helping them learn those skills on a daily basis. So this belongs to all of us. It doesn't just belong to any one specific profession or just to parents. But while we all have a unique piece that we bring to the self-regulation puzzle, we all need to know when we've kind of hit the limit of when we feel like we no longer have anything to bring to the table for this particular child, and who to refer out to based on what the biggest underlying issues are. And then this is also a required slide where we disclose that we do in fact get paid. I get paid all proceeds for sales from my website and then for your participation in this course today. And I am the author of a couple of research studies that we'll be discussing in this course, but I have no other relevant financial or non-financial relationships to disclose. So I'm going to be mentioning a lot of strategies later on, not in this session necessarily, but as we get into the intervention sessions, I'll be mentioning a lot of strategies and tools. And if I mention them, it's just because I like them. I don't get kickbacks from the products that we will be talking about, except for things that are sold through my website. Okay. A little bit about me. My website is sensationalbrain.com, and we are primarily a continuing education website for occupational therapists, and we are also approved. Some of our courses are approved by ASHA for speech therapists, and then we hope that our content is helpful for other professionals as well. My email address is gwen@sensationalbrain.com. And if you are watching the recording of this course and a question comes up while you're viewing, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I will be happy to answer you that way. And then as a company, we are on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest as Sensational Brain. So be sure to follow us there for links to DIY ideas and new relevant research that comes out and more. I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan with my husband of 26 years and our 3 daughters who are growing up and leaving the nest. They are now 22, 20, and 17. And the 22-year-old is driving home. She just graduated from college, but jobs are not abundant right now, as most of you are probably aware through COVID and everything else, all the craziness in our world. So she did find a job here that isn't her dream job, but it will do for now. So we're going to have all 3 under a roof for at least this summer, and then we'll see what happens. But I'm glad to have them all back for a while. Raising 3 kids has taught me a lot about the development of self-regulation. And I think if you would have asked me 22 years ago, what influences how kids behave, I really thought it was mostly nurture. You know, if we follow all the parenting instructions and we do everything right, then our kids will turn out perfectly, right? And now that I've raised 3 kids who share the same genetics, but just kind of came out hardwired to be different from one another, I now think it's definitely a combination of nature and nurture, where you know, kids are born with certain genetic predispositions, certain traits, preferences, and more. And then also certainly the way that they're raised contributes to that. But they're all very different and different temperamentally and more. So it's not all just what we do. You know, it also has to do with their preset hardwiring, so to speak. So it's been a little humbling, as many of you can relate to if you're parents, I'm sure. Okay, here is what we're going to be covering in this course. And primarily today, we're going to be looking at neurological development, and probably we'll get into how do we assess neurological functioning. And then we're going to, in future sessions, we'll talk about how to build a strong neurological foundation. This is when we look at what's good for everybody. What are the forms of intervention that should be in place for all kids everywhere? If you are working in the schools, this is what we often call tier 1 intervention strategies, the things that we want to be in place for everybody, school-wide initiatives and more. And then we're going to be looking at how to make the most of neuroplasticity, and that's where we really start looking at intervention strategies and what parts of the brain are impacted through the different strategies, and the evidence either supporting or not supporting those strategies. And then we'll look at targeting higher level brain centers through the use of cognitive behavioral therapy techniques and rewards and consequences. And then we're going to talk briefly about the role of medication, primarily as it relates to ADHD. We'll look at overall brain health, like what do we need to eat? How much sleep do kids need? Things like that. And some clinical considerations like how do we write goals for self-regulation and regulation of emotions and behaviors. Okay, there are a lot of resources for this course that I wanted to make easily accessible for you. One way to get to lots of those resources is through downloading the course materials or the course manuals that are available for this. And there are many hot links in the course manual you should be able to click through on. However, links change from time to time. And so I'm going to try to keep this page up to date on my website. And let me just show you right now what this page looks like on my website. Let me drag down. You should now be seeing my browser window. And this is a page of resources for those of you participating in this course. It is a password protected page. So the first time you go to this hot link, you will have to enter the password brain, and then it gives you, you'll then see what you're seeing on my screen on your page. And we have the longer version of this course manual that's basically the same thing as the 7-part manuals that you're downloading now, the brain coloring page, the course bibliography, and then I've included a couple of bibliographies from similar courses for those of you who get really interested in the neuro piece and want to dive deeper. This is the neurotransmitter chart that you'll want to have downloaded and printed before our next session. And then I've just included a lot of hot links. And if I ever find out that these links change, I will try to update them on this page too, to make it easy for you to get to a lot of the resources that we're going to be talking about throughout this course. Okay, now I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. I just want to distinguish two different things because it is a little bit confusing. The course page is where you will go to access the course recording, the course material, and more. In fact, while we're talking about that, let me just demonstrate that for you in case there are any questions. And then the resource page is the one that I just showed you. So let's go back here for a minute. And if you want to access the on-demand version of this course in the future, you're going to go, you'll have to be logged into your account, and you can get there through the account and find your orders, or at any given time, you can just find that page. It's the same page that you purchase access to the on-demand version of this course. And once it's in your cart and you're logged in, then when you return back to that page, and let me find it really quickly. Here it is. Right now it says pre-sale because none of the recordings have been uploaded yet since I'm doing that live right now. So eventually when you go back to this page and you're logged into your account, this is where the recording will be found. And then below that, this is where you can access the different segments of the course manual. For today, I'd like you to have part 1 and part 2 downloaded and printed, preferably. The brain coloring page that looks like this. The neurotransmitter chart that I don't have, I don't have it in front of me right now. And then this NBT chart. You know what? I think that something happened to that. I'll make sure it gets up there though. Those are the ones that I would like to have you have printed and follow along on those pages while you're watching this course. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let me go back. So this is the course page, and then the other one is the resource page. Let me now go back to presenter view, and we are going to talk for just a minute about evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is based on integrating clinically appraised research results with the practitioner's clinical expertise and the client's preferences, beliefs, and values. That comes directly to us from AOTA. So we want to know that what we're doing is based in evidence, and we also want to integrate it with what we know about our clients. There are times when I choose to use intervention strategies that have fairly weak evidence behind them because I see that it works for this client and because it's in accordance with their beliefs and values and preferences. So we're going to talk as we go throughout this course about some intervention strategies that don't have very solid, high-level evidence behind them, and yet I use them sometimes anyway, and how I go about making those decisions. But when possible, we want to be able to show a high-level evidence base behind the intervention strategies that we're using. And this is just for you to understand the levels of evidence when we say that something has high-level evidence supporting it or low-level evidence. And this comes to us from otpotential.com. I love her blog. I love her OT Potential Club to help us become aware of the evidence that's out there. And this pyramid shows us what we're talking about. So high-level evidence, or what's often referred to as level 1 evidence, comes to us from systematic reviews. And systematic reviews are able to look at a variety of research on the same form of intervention and say multiple research studies yield similar results. That's the highest level of evidence because the results can be replicated over time. So that's the best evidence there is. And when something has high level or level 1 evidence supporting it, then we can rest assured that, that it's definitely evidence-based. And then critically appraised topics are kind of shorter versions of systematic reviews or abbreviated versions and looking at meta-analyses and more, but still high level overall. And then we start getting into randomized controlled trials. And this is where we're comparing one form of intervention to another form of intervention. That's a little bit higher of a level, and they are assigned to they're assigned randomly to one group or the other. And it's best if I'm comparing it to another form of intervention. So I might be able to show that kids who do yoga in schools do better than kids who do brain breaks using Go Noodle in schools. So I'm comparing one form of intervention to another form of intervention. That's higher level than what's right under that, which could also be randomized controlled study, but it's comparing an intervention group to a control group that doesn't have any intervention happening. That's a little bit lower level because any intervention is almost better than no intervention, right? So it's better if I can show this form of intervention compared to another form of intervention. Right below that is intervention to no intervention, but those both could fall under randomized controlled trials. And then below that would be a little bit lower level, that's cohort studies. That could be looking at things like kids who grow up in settings that have a lot of green space or nature have better self-regulation skills than kids who grew up in inner city urban areas with no nature. So that's interesting, but we can't completely control for other factors. For example, it's possible that kids who are growing up in urban areas with minimal nature around them come from lower socioeconomic homes. And then so we have to ask, is the higher level of self-regulation for the kids who grow up surrounded by nature due to nature, or is it due to the fact that their parents can afford to be in the suburbs with more green space? Those are some things that we can't completely account for. So cohort studies are helpful, but we have to acknowledge that there are some variables that we can't necessarily rule out that could also be contributing to those results. And then the lowest level of research comes to us from case studies where we can say, this intervention works for this child, or maybe 3 or 4 kids, but we can't necessarily say that it will work for kids in general or kids with that diagnosis in general. So case study research is helpful. It's often where we get started looking at new intervention or new strategies, but we can't necessarily generalize to the bigger population. So it's considered lower level of evidence. And then expert opinion and background information would be below that. So in general, we're going to be talking about high-level evidence, mid-level evidence, and low-level evidence, and think of it according to this pyramid. Here are some sources for evidence-based practice. Cochrane.org has great systematic reviews. You can go there and look up things like yoga and see that it has a high-level evidence supporting it. AOTA has some good guidelines for us at this link. NBCOTA has a good research tool available, and then the last 2 listed are primarily designed for mental health practitioners, but I have found some good evidence there too. So these are some sites that you can go to start looking for systematic reviews and the high-level evidence behind them. Okay, now let's talk for a minute about what is self-regulation, because the title of this course talks about helping kids manage their behaviors and emotions, and managing our behaviors and emotions really is self-regulation. Self-regulation is defined as the ability to monitor and control our own behavior, emotions, and thoughts, and alter them in accordance with the demands of the situation. And most experts break it down into 2 primary types of self-regulation. One is what we call cognitive self-regulation, and this is the ability to plan and think ahead, to be self-reflective, be able to monitor my own thoughts and behaviors and evaluate my abilities, and to adjust my behaviors when necessary. An example of this would be that if my 17-year-old has a test tomorrow, hopefully she declines invitations to get together with friends tonight because she knows she needs to stay home to study. And that's good cognitive self-regulation. It shows that she has time management, that she's planning ahead, that she has a level of self-control to be able to excel on that test. And then social emotional self-regulation is our ability to inhibit our negative responses and to delay gratification, and it involves controlling my emotional reactions to situations. An example of this would be if I'm a child and somebody cuts in front of me at the lunch line, I'm able to override the impulse to shove them down. And that's an example of social emotional self-regulation. The development of self-regulation really begins day 1. Initially, when an infant is born, we are primarily providing external self-regulation. We pick them up and rock or bounce them to soothe them. We control how warm they are by wrapping them up or how cool they are by unwrapping and undressing. We change them when they're wet or soiled. We help them fall asleep. We soothe them. We feed them when they're hungry. So it's primarily external regulation. But truly within a couple of weeks, we start seeing some babies who are able to put themselves to sleep or put themselves back to sleep, or who are beginning to self-regulate through a pacifier or thumb sucking. And then by 6 or 7 months of age, most babies are able to wait somewhat patiently, as long as they see that an adult is preparing food for them, and that shows the beginning of delayed gratification. By preschool, we see basic turn taking and sharing. In elementary school, the ability to wait to be called on rather than blurting out an answer. And before we put kids behind the wheel of a car, we really want a high degree of self-regulation so that they can override the impulse to look at a text, or heaven forbid, respond to a text while they're driving, to be able to shift their attention as needed, to pay attention to what's most relevant at the moment, control their anger, road rage, things like that. Our highest level of self-regulation skills happens in our frontal lobe, which isn't fully developed until at least the age of 25, and can be up to 5 years delayed in people with ADHD and some other diagnoses. It could even be by the age of 30, potentially. So that's why car rental companies don't rent without extra money as a deposit for kids under the age of 25, because they just have poor driving records in general. And a lot of that's because they don't have the well-developed self-regulation skills necessary. Self-regulation skills is kind of a term that encompasses a lot of other skills that we don't at first glance think of as falling under this umbrella, such as motor planning and motor skills. We don't really think of that as falling under self-regulation, but many motor skills do fall under that umbrella. Things like, how much force do I use to shut a door, or to set my chair from the desk down to the floor when I come in the morning? How much force do I use on my pencil when writing? We see a strong correlation between coordination and self-regulation. So we see that brain-body connection there. Impulse control, being able to adapt to new settings, to focus, to maintain attention, ignore distractions, inhibit impulses, shift attention when necessary, effective communication of my needs and wants. And that's why speech therapists participate in this course. Communication is huge. It's hard for me to control my reactions if I'm not able to communicate effectively with you what I'm feeling and what my needs are. To be able to follow directions, which also can be impaired by communication deficits. Take turns, handle delayed gratification and wait my turn. Identify my own emotions. This is a big one too. A lot of our kids, they don't even know what they're feeling. How can we teach them to use strategies to change their feelings if they don't even know what they're feeling, right? So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about strategies to help them get in touch with their feelings, and then to be able to manage their thoughts. There are several different models that show self-regulation, and this model shows that it underlies and overlaps with motivation, self-talk, metacognition, self-control, executive functioning, and emotional regulation. This model from Zimmerman, Zimmerman's model breaks self-regulation down into 3 primary phases: the forethought phase, the performance phase, and the self-reflection phase. We all go through these phases for pretty much everything that we do. But for most of us, it happens automatically. We don't have to put a lot of effort into it. An example would be in my preparation for this course. And some of you have walked through this with me. I initially thought I could break this course down into independent modules, and I started offering those in May, and a couple of you participated in those. And I wanted them to be self-standing units, so you wouldn't have to take the whole 12 hours. So in my forethought phase, I broke it down and I set some goals, what should be a part of part 1 and so forth. And the performance phase, I actually gave those first 2 webinars that I intended to be self-sufficient units. And then in the self-reflection phase, I thought, I'm not very happy with that. I really feel like this needs to be one course. I didn't feel like I could separate out those chunks of information and feel good about it. So I sent everybody an email saying I make it into a 12-hour course, and here's the way that you can join and participate in that. So I changed it up, and that changed the way that I am presenting this course. We go through these 3 phases with almost everything that we do, but for most of us, it happens automatically. For kids who this isn't happening automatically for, we want to bring these 3 phases to their conscious awareness, where we help them think through, what do I need to do before I sit down to do my work, to set myself up for success? What are some strategies I can use while I am performing this task to keep myself focused, to keep myself motivated? And then to learn to think about, how did that go? What worked? What didn't work? What am I going to do differently next time? And I have simplified this, and I'm going to show you a simpler graphic later that I've just labeled before, during, and after that I use with kids. Older kids, maybe I sit down and we just write out, what am I going to do before? What am I going to do during? How can I think through how it went after? How am I going to know whether this worked or didn't work? So we really just want to bring it to the kids' conscious awareness level if this isn't happening naturally for them. This model shows all that contributes to self-regulation. Mind and spirit includes cognitive and emotional development, mindset, connection to something bigger than yourself, and more. Body and behaviors looks at physical health and well-being, sensory motor awareness and regulation. Systems and structures may look at things like if a classroom is conducive to self-regulation, or if it's so overstimulating that all of us would fall apart in that classroom. And then definitely culture plays a big role in self-regulation also. How we're raised. Some of us grow up in households where we're taught to stuff our emotions and keep them in, but someday they're going to come out, right? Or some of us are able to grow up in households where we're free to express our emotions, and we yell and cry, but then we hug and we make up. So the way that we're raised definitely plays a big role in self-regulation also. And then we have my favorite model, and this is the pyramid of learning that comes to us from the ALERT program curriculum. The ALERT program has been around a while, and they introduced us to the terminology around, how does your engine run? Is your engine going really fast and you're about to crash? Or is your engine going really slow and you need a little push to get going? Or are you at that just right phase where you're able to focus on what's most important, but you could come to a stop quickly if necessary also, right? I love that language. We've kind of built on that through the BrainWorks curriculum. And this model comes directly from the ALERT program curriculum, and they've allowed us to share it here in this webinar. And this shows all that goes into the development of self-regulation. So look at the top of the pyramid with me for a minute. Academic learning, the activities of daily living, and behavior. When we are able to free up our brain for those 3 pieces of life at an age-appropriate level, we have self-regulation, right? I will be successful at an age-appropriate level in my activities of daily living, in my behavior, and in my academic learning when I have developed age-appropriate self-regulation skills, okay? Everything below those 3 bricks on our pyramid are skills that contribute to the self-regulation needed to be successful in those 3 areas. So we can think of this as a chronological developmental pyramid, and to a large extent it is. For the most part, the bottom of the pyramid are the things that are developed at pre-birth or at birth, and then the lower levels of the pyramid are what we're focusing on in early childhood, and then we start getting into skills that are further refined and developed in grade school. So to a large extent it's chronological, but it's not absolutely chronological. Like I am, excuse me, still refining my vestibular and auditory sensory systems while I am fine-tuning postural adjustments. So there's definitely some jumping around that goes on in early childhood and more. But for the most part, we can think about this as a developmental trajectory, okay? We want to have the lower levels of the pyramid solid and in place before we start addressing the higher up skills on the pyramid. So for the most part, we're going to think about this as a developmental pyramid. And let's just look at it for a minute. At the bottom of our pyramid, we have the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Intact at birth, but we continue to see neural proliferation, new neurons being formed at a very rapid rate up until the age of 2. In fact, we have more neural connections in our brains at age 2 than we do at any other time of our lives. It's all downhill from there. Not really. It's actually a good thing as some of those start getting pruned away, but it is true that we have more neural connections at age 2 than at any other time. But that pruning away is an important process that it allows us to become more efficient and effective at the skills that are actually necessary. So we'll talk more about that later. So basically in place at birth, the sensory systems are basically developed and working by birth as well. Most of them are developed in the second trimester, but they continue to be more refined in the first couple of years of life, and then we begin becoming better at integrating forms of sensory input with each other. So I'm hearing and seeing simultaneously and responding accordingly. I'm feeling and moving at the same time, so I'm integrating sensory input from multiple forms of sensations. This is what early childhood is all about. We're touching, moving, licking, sucking, exploring, because it's all about development of our sensory systems one at a time, and then in integration with each other. And then, ages 3 and 4, we start getting better postural security, integration of the primitive reflexes, higher level motor planning. And then by the time we head into kindergarten, we start working on eye-hand coordination, ocular motor control, more refined postural adjustments, auditory language skills, visual spatial perception, and higher levels of attention and focus. And then that brings us toward the top of our pyramid. We have the basics in place by age 5. So I think by age 5, we can kind of picture being right here on the pyramid, where we have most of the skills below this line in place by age 5. Hopefully you're seeing my cursor. I'm pointing to the area right below where it says daily living activities and behavior, okay? Certainly, we see a certain level of behavior in place with little kids, etc. But what I'm really intending you to see is that all of these skills below that point are basically intact by age 5. That frees up our brain to start becoming more independent in the activities of daily living, to start behaving in a way that meets school expectations, that allows us to be efficient and effective learners, okay? So the basics for self-regulation are in place by age 5. Now, sometimes for whatever reason, one of the pieces that we see on this pyramid doesn't develop as it should. Sometimes there's a skill set missing. Think about what that does to the stability of our pyramid. Imagine if you're building a pyramid out of bricks or blocks, and you just, like you're playing Jenga, and you just leave off a block or a brick near the bottom of your pyramid. How does that impact the rest of your pyramid? Makes it a little shaky, a little less stable, right? We can still develop the higher level skills, but it might topple easily. The lower level bricks are they're the foundational ones. If I leave off a brick higher up on the pyramid, you may notice that it's missing less. But if we leave off one of the big bricks near the bottom of the pyramid, you're going to notice its absence, right? We're going to have an unstable pyramid. And when we think about that from a self-regulation perspective, what does that mean? They lose it, they blow up, they melt down, all the different terms that we use. They could look a lot like a pyramid crumbling, true? So we are going to be thinking about this pyramid throughout this entire 12-hour course, both from an assessment standpoint, where we want to decide what's the lowest level of the pyramid that seems to be problematic. And we want to start by addressing those lower level skills first. We want to think about really solidifying the foundation of our pyramid, because when we build a solid foundation of our pyramid, it becomes much easier for the higher level skills to develop efficiently and effectively without a lot of direct intervention in most cases. So we want to use our assessment tools to think about what's the lowest level of the pyramid that needs our intervention, and we want to begin there. And then from an intervention standpoint, we want to think about tying it back to those assessment results and spending more time on the lowest level of the pyramid that seems problematic. that varies to some extent based on the child's age and more, and I'll give you some examples of that. If a child has made it without a diagnosis and, now he's 12 and he's having a lot of meltdowns and so forth, and I'm thinking of that from a behavior standpoint, I may see that there are some sensory processing differences and more, but because of his age, we may spend less time going back to rebuild the skills that should have developed early on, and we may spend more time intervening from a behavioral standpoint. But the younger that we are, the more time, or the younger our clients are, the more time that we really want to put into intervening at the lowest level of the pyramid that seems to be problematic. But we'll get more into that as we talk about case studies and just clinical reasoning, how I make that decision of how much time. I may see that there are some issues in the sensory systems, but he's 12. So how do I decide how much time I'm going to spend versus using forms of adaptations and modifications instead, based on age and several other factors? So we'll get more into that. But I just want you to keep this pyramid in mind. So you might want to just kind of dog ear this page in your course manual so that you can refer back to this pyramid easily as we talk. There were a couple of people that were having audio issues, a couple of our live participants easily. It looks like on my end now that you're all connected through audio. So if those of you are having issues earlier, could just let me know through the question control panel. That would give me some reassurance that this is going okay for everybody. And for those of you here live, feel free to use that question box anytime. I see it on my screen and I can answer it that way. Okay, so we are now ready to get into brain development. And this is the stuff I find so interesting, and I hope that you do as well. So neurological development begins during the 3rd week of gestation. It's amazing, isn't it? That's very, very early on. And initially what we see is the neural tube with 3 sections: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And the neural tube defects happen very early on. By age 29, for example, is when we see spina bifida. That happens very early on, where we see that neural tube not form the way that it should. And then the folds in the brain are what increase after about 3 months. So we're here, and at that point on, what we really see is everything, this basics are there, and we continue to see more of the neural folds develop, this sulci and gyri, throughout the rest of gestation. And then at birth, it's intact. And then we continue to see more development of the neural folds throughout, all the way up through adulthood until the age of 25 or 30 even. We continue to see further brain development that way. Okay, so if you have printed out your brain coloring page, now is when you might want to get out your color pencils or your crayons to start adding notes to your brain coloring page. On the coloring page, I did not separate out the lobes from one another. So you can choose to do that, but you don't have to do that. You can kind of just estimate based on the picture that you're seeing on your screen right now if you want to designate the different lobes of the brain on your coloring page. But we're just going to kind of talk through them real quickly right now and the major roles of each of the cerebral lobes. So let's look first at the frontal lobe right up here in the forehead, kind of to the middle top section of your brain. The frontal lobe is where we have our highest level thinking skills or executive functioning skills happen in our frontal lobe. So planning, intellect, problem solving, and abstract reasoning are there. And then because the motor center is right here in this prefrontal gyrus, that's where we get some voluntary movement as well. The temporal lobe is kind of behind the temples of your head. And this is where we have long-term memory and speech comprehension happens in the temporal lobe. We get object perception, facial recognition, and our auditory center is in our temporal lobe as well. And then the pink part, or what's designated in pink in this picture, is our parietal lobe. So now we're moving back on the brain, and this is where we get touch perception and movement control. Movement happens and is controlled by several parts of the brain, and part of it's in the parietal lobe, and manipulation of objects happens here too. And the occipital lobe is the lowest part of the cerebrum, and this is our visual center to a large extent, where we get visual reception, orientation, and shape perception. And then at the base of our brain, we have the cerebellum. And this is often what we think of as the mini brain, and this is where coordination primarily comes from the cerebellum, and balance and some of our reflexive motor acts come from our cerebellum as well. And then the brain stem right here, this is where we get information from our brain and our spinal cord. The sensory tracts for pain, temperature, and pressure sensations come through here. So that's the lowest level of our brain. Okay, I love explaining the brain to kids. I think it's really helpful for them to be able to picture what's going on in their brains. This video I'm going to show to you, it explains the model that comes to us from the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. And I like using this hand model to help kids understand the lower level, mid-level, and higher level centers of the brain. And we can start thinking about the feelers of the brain and the thinkers of the brain and more through this model. So I'm going to show this to you right now.
Now, you probably know the name Dan Siegel. He's one of the giants in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And Dan came up with a lovely hand model of the human brain. So let's kind of go through the hand model of the brain. And this can be useful for you to understand, but at times it might be useful for you to actually share this with your client. The wrist, the forearm coming up to here, is like your spinal cord. And right here at the end of the wrist is like the base of your skull. And here, at the bottom of your palm, this is like the reptile brain, the life support system of the brain. So, you know, if the rest of your brain is wiped out through, say, for example, a stroke or a car accident, this life support part of your brain, the reptile brain, can still keep your body alive, can still keep all your organs functioning, and your breath and your heart and so forth. And this is where a lot of autonomic nervous system operates and stems from, this reptile brain. Now, above the reptile brain is the mammalian brain, often called the limbic brain or the emotional brain. So reptiles, they've got the fight or flight response, or they've got the freeze, shut down, flop and drop response, but they don't really have anything that is even remotely close to the complex emotional states that we see in mammals. And the limbic brain has many different parts to it, but two in particular that we'll be looking at in this course are the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, don't worry about memorizing those terms for now. We will revisit them later. But this kind of is the middle brain, the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, basically responsible for emotions. Now, on top of the limbic, mammalian, emotional brain, you've got the cerebral cortex, the thinking cap of the brain. The cerebral cortex is much thicker in mammals, but especially so in primates, and particularly so in human beings, more so than any other primate. And this cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain, responsible for consciousness and cognition. And right at the front of the cerebral cortex, you have the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right up here at the front of your forehead, above your eyes. And particularly important to us is the medial prefrontal cortex, this bit in the middle, right at the front, this bit up here. This plays a very important role in mindfulness and awareness. So let's just go through it again. You've got your spinal cord, you've got your reptile brain. Underneath your cerebral cortex, you've got your mammalian brain with the amygdala, the hippocampus, responsible for emotions. And then you've got your cerebral cortex, your thinking cap of the brain on top, and the medial prefrontal cortex right here in the center of the front, right there. Now,
Okay, I know it can be a little choppy when I share videos over GoToWebinar, but I just want you to know that they're there. So if it intrigues you, you can go back and watch them again. We've included the YouTube links for you to be able to see those on your own if that's helpful for you. And then this is a visual that was created by one of my colleagues, Angela Isbell, and I just love it. And it's another way to explain those thinkers and the feelers to the kids visually. And so we talk about how The thinkers live in the upstairs part of the brain. So for you and I, we think of that as our frontal lobe. Those are our higher level thinking skills that live up there. And the feelers live in the basement of our brain. So I open up my hand and show them, my thumb and the inside. Those are my feelers. And then she's given the thinkers and the feelers names. The thinkers have names like calming Chloe, creative Kate, problem solving Paul, and flexible Fran. So they're good ones to have in charge of our brain. And then our feelers have names like alerting Al, controlling Carly, frightened Phi, and anxiety Art. Those are our feelers. Our feelers are good too, but sometimes our feelers react in a way that may not be proportionate to the situation and that may get us in trouble. So we want to talk to the kids about keeping the thinkers engaged. We want the thinkers to really be in charge most of the time. And we can call them the lid of the brain or the thinking cap of the brain. When we flip our lid, the thinkers are disengaged and the feelers take over. And that puts us into a state of fight or flight sometimes, and it causes us to react in big ways. So these are the kinds of tools that are helpful for helping kids understand their brain and how to learn self-regulation. I also have a couple of models with me that I use with kids a lot. I've ordered both of these on Amazon, so if you're able to see my webcam camera now, which I hope you're able to, I have this mitten model, which I got on Amazon, and you would tuck your thumb in and then curl your fingers over, and this shows the frontal lobe, the different lobes of the brain, and it can help us see some of the really inside parts of the brain, like the amygdala and more. So we can talk about, if you flip your lid, these are the sections of the brain that take over. So it's good for kids to be able to picture what part of the brain we're addressing through strategies, and they love hearing these big terms. So if I talk about, we're going to practice meditation today to try to turn down your amygdala just a little bit. And I show them where their amygdala is. And we talk about your amygdala has too much power and we need to kind of help it to calm down. Those are the kinds of language that I like to use with kids. And then I also have this kind of squishy brain model that I also got from Amazon. And I can show kids on here the parts of the brain. Like this, the amygdala is teeny tiny, but he has way too much power. And he's kind of making life really challenging for you right now. So it just helps kids to be able to picture that. And it also, I feel like it helps me connect with them emotionally, because many of these kids are constantly being told, you're out of control, you're bad. That's the message they're getting. And I want to help them see, you're a great kid. Your amygdala needs to calm down a little bit, so it kind of takes the focus off of them being naughty or bad and more on what do we need to do to help your brain be more effective. Okay, so those are some ways that I do that. I just want to talk briefly about the whole left versus right debate. We definitely have skills that happen in the left side of our brain and our right side of the brain. The left side of the brain tends to be more where our logic and reasoning happens, mathematical skills happen in that side of the brain. The right side of our brain tends to be our creative side. This is where we tap into our emotional intelligence and more. So it is true that that different skills are kind of housed in each right and left hemisphere of our brain. However, we hear a lot of people say, I'm really left-brained or I'm really right-brained. And researchers in general do not see that to be true. They do not see that creative people have more activity on the right side of the brain than the left side, or that people who are really good at math have more active left sides of the brain than right. We don't really see that in the evidence. So we know that that specific center might be more developed, but we can't necessarily say, I'm right-brained, that's why I'll never be good at math, or something like that. That doesn't seem to be played out in the evidence. So it's neither here nor there, but it's kind of interesting, I thought. Okay, so this looks more like what you're seeing on your brain coloring page. So this is where I'd like you to kind of get out your colors and color along as you label these parts on your coloring page so that you'll be able to refer back to this easily. And I'm also going to be showing you on the model up here, okay? So the first part that I want you to focus on is the corpus callosum. And see on the page on my screen, the corpus callosum is shown in light pink. It's not really light pink, but that's just the color they've chosen. So you can use any color you like to color in the corpus callosum on your coloring page. I have colored mine in yellow That's the corpus callosum on your brain coloring page, and it's the part labeled as number 3. So by number 3 on your coloring page, write corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the part of our brain that connects the left and the right hemispheres. This is what allows information to flow from the right hemisphere to the left and vice versa. And most information does need to go to both hemispheres. There are very few forms of input or information that are handled on only one hemisphere or the other. So in general, it's being combined with other information and then a response is generated. So it's important that our corpus callosum is well developed. The more developed our corpus callosum is, the more effective and efficient our brain is at allowing communication between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So that's the corpus callosum. The thalamus is the next structure of the brain that I want you to be familiar with. And it is right here, kind of right below the corpus callosum on the screen slide. On your coloring page, it's this little round bulb that I've colored in as orange on my coloring page. And it's the part labeled as number 2 on your coloring page. That's the thalamus. Number 2 is the thalamus. The thalamus is known as Grand Central Station in our brains. The Grand Central Station takes in almost every form of sensory input, goes to the thalamus first. And from there, the thalamus decides what other parts of the brain need this information and sends it out accordingly. That's why we think of it as Grand Central Station. So things like things that I see and things that I smell and things that I feel, that information goes to my thalamus, and then my thalamus decides which part of my brain needs that information. If I feel something hot, that information may be sent to the motor control centers of my brain to help me move my hand away, right? If I smell smoke, the thalamus might send that information to the higher level centers of my brain to help me think through, how am I going to get out of this house if it's on fire, right? So the thalamus makes those decisions about what other parts of the brain need to know about the sensory input that I'm receiving. It's Grand Central Station for all sensory input except smell. I actually used a bad example there. The sense of smell does not go to the thalamus. It goes to a structure in the limbic system, actually, which is our emotional control center, which is why smell does evoke powerful emotions. So the sense of smell does not go to the thalamus, so I apologize for the example of smelling smoke. That's a bad example for the thalamus. But the example of feeling something hot is a good example. All forms of sensory input go to the thalamus except for the sense of smell. So we think of it as Grand Central Station. So what I've done on my coloring page is I've written the term thalamus, and then right under that, I've written Grand Central Station. And this just can become a one-page reference for you as we get into talking about the strategies that improve volume in the corpus callosum. You can refer back to this and think, oh yeah, that's what the corpus callosum is. So I hope that that's how the coloring page will work for you. Okay, and so number 2 is the thalamus. And then I also want you to look at, on this page, the hypothalamus over here. Hypothalamus means under, and it is actually located under the thalamus. On your coloring page, number 8 is the hypothalamus. So by the number 8, write the word hypothalamus. The hypothalamus primarily serves as the communication center for the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is the communication center for the pituitary gland, and its primary role is maintaining homeostasis in the body. Maintaining homeostasis in the body, such as temperature regulation, monitoring hunger and thirst, fatigue, helping hormones be released that help you sleep, things like that. So the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases hormones that assist with triggering hunger, inducing sleep, things like that. So the pituitary gland is number 7 on your brain coloring page. It's this little tiny pea-shaped organ right here. that comes off of the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is a master gland in our bodies, and it secretes hormones that assist with maintaining homeostasis. Some of those hormones include cortisol, which is a stress hormone that allows us to react appropriately if we're in danger, and oxytocin that allows us to bond with other humans. Those are some of the biggies. So a pituitary gland is considered a master gland, and it assists with maintaining homeostasis in the body. And it is number 7 on your coloring page. Hypothalamus is number 8, and it's the communication center for the pituitary gland. So it also plays a role in maintaining homeostasis. Okay, and then let's see, anything else on this page that I want to point out to you? I think that's it on this page. We're going to keep adding to our coloring page as we go on. Note the cerebellum. The cerebellum, oh, I forgot to mention that. The cerebellum is labeled as number 4 on your coloring page. We primarily think of this as our motor center. The cerebellum is primarily our motor center. There are several other structures in the brain that contribute to motor control as well, but the cerebellum is the biggest structure of the brain that contributes to motor control. And we're going to get to a few of the other ones on your coloring page in just a minute. Okay, any questions about those before we go on? So the corpus callosum is number 3 on your coloring page, and that connects the 2 hemispheres. The thalamus is number 2 on your coloring page, and we want to think of that as grand central station for sensory processing. Number 8 on your coloring page is the hypothalamus that serves as the communication center for the pituitary gland. Number 7 is the pituitary gland, and it's a master gland. And number 4 on your coloring page is the cerebellum. Okay, on this slide, I want you to notice the primary motor cortex, which is at the back of the frontal lobe. And that, you might remember back in graduate school that what we call the motor homunculus that showed how much of this prefrontal gyrus is dedicated to the hand and the foot and so forth. And then right behind that, we see the somatosensory cortex that's right behind where the frontal lobe ends, or that major gyri. And there was a sensory homunculus too that showed that the majority of it is dedicated to our tongue and our fingers, because those have a lot of sensory receptors in them. So I just want you to remember where those are. And then I also want you to see where those 2 centers that are responsible for speech and language are. Broca's area is in our temporal lobe, and actually, I'm sorry, Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and it's concerned with speech production. And the Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, and Wernicke's area has more to do with speech comprehension, but they both contribute to speech and language. So Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and it's primarily speech production. Wernicke's area is a little bit farther back in the temporal lobe, and it has to do with speech comprehension. In most people, these speech and language centers are primarily in the left side of the brain, or the left hemisphere. They're present in both, but they're more developed in the left hemisphere in most people. Okay, just glancing over my notes to make sure that I mentioned everything from this picture. Okay, now we're going to look at the structures that make up the limbic system in the brain. And when we think about the limbic system, we primarily think about our emotional control centers. So watch this video, and then we'll talk a little bit more in depth and label some of those structures on our brain coloring sheet as well.
So let's talk about the limbic system. What is the limbic system? Well, it's a set of structures in the brain, and many of those structures play an important role in regulating emotion. But something that gets kind of confusing when you talk about the limbic system is that experts can't actually agree on what structures make up the entire limbic system. So for our purposes, I'm going to address some of the most important structures and ones that everyone pretty much agrees are part of the limbic system. Now, before I get going into the nitty-gritty, so to speak, I want to give you a quick overview of what structures we're going to talk about. And the way I remember these structures is through this little cartoon here. This is a hippopotamus, and he's wearing a hat. Now, why is this hippopotamus wearing the stylish hat? Well, this is my way of remembering the four most important components of the limbic system when it comes to emotion. So we see a hippopotamus here. I'll write hippo. And we see him wearing a hat. I'll write hat. Now, for this to be a mnemonic, it has to be something useful. And the reason I think of this is these are the four main structures of the limbic system when it comes to emotion. So HAT stands for hypothalamus, A for amygdala, T for thalamus, and hippo, short for hippocampus. And these happen to be the four structures that I'd like to talk about. So let's get to a little more complicated diagram. And what you see here is my best attempt at drawing the limbic system. Now, limbic system structures sit on top of the brainstem, and this is the brainstem. And you can imagine this as the very bottom of your brain, and here's the spinal cord coming out of it. And the spinal cord goes all the way down your back to about your tailbone. Now, the limbic system are these structures up here that are drawn in bright colors. Now, to orient you to this diagram, this is what you would see if you pulled off like the top part of your brain, which is called the cortex. And it's facing in this direction. In other words, while this isn't anatomically correct, let's say your eyes are here, your nose is here, and your mouth is here. Again, this is not anatomically correct, but this you can see is the front, and this is the back. So I kind of drew it at an angle so you can kind of get a 3D idea. So let's remove this and go back to talking about the anatomical structures. So this blue thing here, this is called a thalamus. You actually have two of these, one here and one on the other side. So your thalamus functions as like a sensory relay station, meaning the things that you see, hear, taste, touch, all these senses you have come through your nerves and ultimately end up in your thalamus. And the thalamus directs these senses into the appropriate areas in the cortex, as well as other areas of the brain. And I mention this in terms of an emotion lecture because emotions are very contingent on the things that you see, the things that you touch and hear. And you may have noticed there's one sense that I didn't mention, and that's a sense of smell. And the sense of smell actually is the only sense that you have that actually bypasses this thalamus. And instead, it has its own private relay station that when it comes from the nose, it goes to a certain area in the brain. And that area of the brain actually has to be very close to other areas that regulate emotion, which explains why sometimes certain scents can evoke very powerful memories and bring you back to a certain moment in time. But in terms of emotion, I mentioned thalamus because of how the senses play an important role in your emotions. Now you see here there's these two purple structures. And this is known as an amygdala. Amygdala. Now the amygdala is sometimes called the aggression center. And experiments have actually shown that if you stimulate the amygdala, you can produce feelings of anger and violence, as well as fear and anxiety. I'm going to put stimulate and represent it as a dark green plus sign. So you stimulate the amygdala, it invokes feelings of anger, violence, fear, and anxiety. On the other hand, if you've destroyed your amygdala, and I'll represent destruction as a red negative sign, if you destroy the amygdala, it can cause a very mellowing effect. All right, mellow. And this mellowing effect, in the context of a destroyed amygdala, is actually noted by a psychologist named Dr. Kluver and a neurosurgeon by the name of Dr. Busey. And I mention Kluver and Busey because in medicine there's actually a syndrome known as Kluver-Busey syndrome. And that's when there's a bilateral destruction of your amygdala. And bilateral means both. When you have bilateral destruction of the amygdalas, that can result in certain symptoms that are often seen, like hyperorality, which means you put things in your mouth a lot. Also, hypersexuality, as well as disinhibited behavior. And disinhibited behavior is when you ignore social conventions, you can act very impulsively, you don't consider the risks of your behavior. So you do dangerous, reckless things. So that's Kluver-Bucy syndrome, and that's, again, when you destroy both sides of your amygdalas. And the way I remember this is I think if you stimulate the amygdalas, that can cause fear and anxiety. And people that have anxiety disorders or experience an anxiety attack, sometimes they're given a medication known as a benzodiazepine. Sometimes they're called benzos. And these benzodiazepine medications function pharmacologically very similar to alcohol. And think of what happens when people consume too much alcohol. Sometimes you see these types of behaviors. You see hyperorality, you might be eating a lot, you might have hypersexuality, and of course you get disinhibited behavior. Think of the person with a lampshade on their head. They're ignoring certain social conventions because of the effect of alcohol. So that's how I remember the effect of stimulating versus destroying the amygdala. And this green structure here that you see curving around the thalamus is known as the hippocampus. And the hippocampus plays a key role in forming new memories. What it does is it helps to convert your short-term memory, abbreviated as STM, it helps convert that short-term memory into your long-term memory. And I mention that in this conversation because when you think back in your memories, whether it's short-term memory or long-term memory, these memories can invoke emotions as well. So the hippocampus is an important structure in forming long-term memories. And people with damage to this area, they have difficulty forming new memories. So everything that they experience just basically fades away. Now, what's interesting about this is if your hippocampus is destroyed, while you can't form new memories, you still have your old memories intact. So your long-term memory functions just fine. So that's the hippocampus. Now lastly, this orange structure here, this orange structure is the hypothalamus. And hypo means below. So hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And here's the thalamus, and it's below it. So that's where it gets its name from. And the hypothalamus is actually a very tiny structure. And this diagram here really exaggerates the size of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is so small, it actually makes up less than 1% of the total volume of your brain. It's about the size of a kidney bean. And the hypothalamus plays an incredible role in regulating so many functions in your body. But for our purposes, we're talking about limbic system structures in terms of emotion. So when it comes to emotion, hypothalamus you can think of as regulating the autonomic nervous system. I'll abbreviate it as ANS. And the autonomic nervous system you can think of as fight or flight versus rest and digest. Now I'm going to discuss this further in a different video, but right now just think of it as regulating the autonomic nervous system. It does this by controlling the endocrine system, by triggering the release of hormones into your bloodstream. And some of these hormones that are triggered to release are things like epinephrine or norepinephrine, and epinephrine is actually very commonly known as adrenaline. So if you ever think of the phrase like a lot of adrenaline pumping through your veins, that's actually being regulated by the hypothalamus. Now, your hypothalamus is also involved with regulating other basic drives like hunger, thirst, sleep, sex. But in terms of emotion, I think it's most important to note that it regulates the autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight or rest and digest response. So that's the limbic system. And these are the four basic structures: the thalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. So these are the basic structures of the limbic system.
Okay. Hopefully you are all seeing the videos okay and hearing them. I just feel like it kind of helps to reinforce the concepts, but we're going to look at them on this page as well and label a couple of more. So on your coloring page, the amygdala is number 6. Number 6. I've colored it in red on my page, the amygdala. And the amygdala plays a role in memory, in decision making, but we mostly think of our hypothalamus as governing our reactions to fear, our survival instinct. So in general, the amygdala is active when we perceive that we are in danger of some kind. That's the amygdala. And then I also want you to note the hippocampus, and on your coloring sheet, the hippocampus is number 5. And it's kind of on your coloring page is kind of this darker gray area. That's the hippocampus. The hippocampus plays a role in memory and learning and spatial navigation and behaviors. An interesting thing about the hippocampus is that it's one of the few structures that shows fairly significant neuroplasticity throughout the lifespan. We know in general that we have the best ability to change the way that the brain is wired in early childhood, and we continue to have more neuroplasticity available to us when we're young, and then at some point it becomes harder. It becomes more difficult for us older dogs to learn new tricks and so forth, and that's because we have diminishing access to neuroplasticity. But we do have some ability to change the way the brain is structured and wired throughout the lifespan. Mostly in the hippocampus. We can see pretty impressive new formation, new neural connections, and more in the hippocampus all the way until late adulthood. So number 6 on your coloring page is the amygdala. That mostly has to do with our fear-based responses. And then number 5 is the hippocampus, which plays a big role in memory and learning and behavior. And both of those are part of the limbic system, along with the hypothalamus and the thalamus that we discussed on a previous page. Okay, so I think we have labeled all of the parts on your coloring page except for the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is number 1 on your coloring page. The basal ganglia, this is a little deceiving because the basal ganglia looks like a structure and a separate structure on your coloring page. It's not. This is just kind of showing you in general where the basal ganglia is. The basal ganglia is actually as a group of nuclei, specialized ganglia would be another term for that, that are responsible for things like motor control, motor learning, executive functions, and behaviors. So the basal ganglia plays a role in motor control, motor learning, and behavior and emotions. Those could be the ones that you list. The basal ganglia is, and it's number 1 on your brain coloring page. Okay, on the slide that we're looking at now, we're just focusing in a little bit more on how the structures relate to one another. The amygdala is deep within our temporal lobe, and it primarily modulates our reactions to events that are important for our survival. It's mostly associated with the fear response. We'll talk more about this later, but the amygdala is one of the structures that is heavily involved in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And what seems to happen is that over time, a form of sensory input goes straight to the thalamus. The brain recognizes that that form of sensory input indicates danger. And over time, this becomes then a hardwired signal to the amygdala. So it goes straight from the thalamus to the amygdala without allowing the higher level brain centers, such as the frontal lobe, a chance to weigh in. So it goes straight to the amygdala. The amygdala says, we're in trouble, and it responds in this big and dramatic way, which is good if it needs to respond in a big and dramatic way. But because of this hardwired response, sometimes that sensory trigger no longer is an indicator of danger, but yet we're still getting this response. Let me just take you through an example and it'll make more sense. Think about our soldiers who serve in the Middle East, like in Afghanistan and Iraq. While they're under a lot of stress, and that ongoing stress causes excess amounts of a neurotransmitter called glutamate to be present in the brain. Glutamate seems to be helping to create this hardwired connection between the thalamus and the amygdala. So this sensory trigger is often a loud noise. And when they are in the Middle East, a loud noise typically does mean either something bad just happened or something bad is about to happen. Maybe somebody just got killed. One loud noise is often followed by another loud noise when bombs are happening and things like that. So this becomes a hardwired connection. The loud noise goes straight to the amygdala. The signal is sent straight to the amygdala, and it helps the body to respond in a fight or flight way as it needs to when that person is in Iraq or Afghanistan. But now they come back to the United States, and here ideally a loud noise doesn't always mean we're in danger. Like I just literally heard a loud noise upstairs, and a lot of times it makes us kind of startle, but then we look around and we think, I'm not actually in danger. I bet my daughter's working out, something like that. So I calm down very quickly. But for these people who have formed this hardwired connection, the loud noise instantly sends them into fight or flight without allowing the thinkers of the brain the chance to weigh in on, am I actually in danger or not? So that's part of the PTSD process. It's easier to visualize in soldiers, when it's more of a known trigger. We don't always know in the kids that we work with what their triggers or cues might be that are causing this big reaction. Could be a certain person or a certain sound or a certain smell. And so we have to kind of be detectives to see what seems to be the common denominator for these kids. Okay? This visual is helpful at showing us the ideal balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Ideally, we want these two structures to be balancing each other out. We want the prefrontal cortex, which we think about as the thinkers in the brain, to be keeping the feelers of the brain in check. So we want these two to both be working, but we want them to be keeping each other in balance. We don't want one to have more power than the other, or we might not always be reacting as we should. And there are some things that threaten this balance or that disrupt this balance. Cue exposure is one. Like a loud sound. That's a cue for people who have served overseas. For kids, it could be hunger. If they grew up in a house where hunger was never met with food, then hunger can send them into fight or flight because they've got to have a big reaction to get that need met, right? Lapse activated consumption. I had to look that term up the first time I saw it, but it makes perfect sense to me. And some of you I know have experienced this as well. I have weeks where I think, I'm gonna eat healthy all week, right? And it might be a day where I'm working in the clinic and somebody has brought donuts to the clinic. And so by 10 o'clock that morning, I've already had 3 donuts because donuts are my weakness. And I feel like, well, I've already blown it for the week, so there's no point eating healthy for the rest of the day or maybe even the rest of the week. I'll start fresh next week, right? Have some of you done that too? So that's lapse activated consumption. And so when we think about the kids that we work with, we want to think about behavior plans and how if we are setting up a behavior program where a child is working for a reward that he will end at 3 p.m., that he will earn at 3 p.m., but he's already blown it by 9 a.m., where's the motivation to behave for the rest of the day, right? So we want to think about putting behavior programs in place that give him frequent opportunities to earn rewards so he can't blow it by 9 a.m. for the whole day, right? We want to think about putting measures like that in place. Otherwise, it powers down the thinkers, just like me having 3 donuts by 10 a.m. I just give up, my feelers take over, it feels good to eat donuts, I'm going to keep eating donuts all day, right? Anytime I'm just in a bad mood, that powers down my thinkers, powers up my feelers, and allows them to take over. Resource depletion, like being too tired or too sleepy, same thing. It powers down my thinkers and it allows my feelers to take over. I feel like I'm in danger if I'm hungry or I'm tired. I kind of go into a little bit of fight or flight, and that's what allows the feelers to take over. And then other things like alcohol consumption or prefrontal brain damage by nature are going to power down the thinkers of the brain. So we want to think about how to reestablish balance here through the strategies that we use. Okay, now we also want to be aware of the different branches of the nervous system. So the nervous system is primarily divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is our brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the nerves that exit from our central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is broken down into somatic, or what we often call voluntary. And this has to do with our ability to move our muscles and get feedback from our muscles about how they're feeling, if they're tired, and more. And then the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system is involuntary in nature. It happens automatically. And the involuntary branch is further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. The sympathetic branch is what we often call fight or flight, right? It perceives there's something that we need to be sympathetic to, that we need to be aware of, that we need to respond to. And so we go into fight or flight to make sure to self-preserve, right? To keep ourselves safe or get ourselves safe if possible. Fight or flight. And sometimes this is called fight, flight, or freeze, but we'll look at that in a little bit. And then the other branch is the parasympathetic branch, and we refer to this as rest and digest, or sometimes feed and breed. So these are processes that happen automatically also, but this is the branch that we want to be dominant most of the time. When our parasympathetic branch is dominant, it allows us to free up our brain for naturally occurring processes like digestion, immunity, focus, and more. It's very hard for those naturally occurring processes to happen when we're in fight or flight, because we're having a big response to some perceived threat, and it would be hard to focus or pay attention or to respond appropriately when we're in fight or flight. So we want to think about strategies that allow the parasympathetic branch to be dominant or active at any given time. And this shows what happens. When the parasympathetic branch is dominant, our pupils constrict, we salivate so that we can begin the digestion process. We're able to take slower, deeper breaths, our heart rate slows, digestion is taking place as it should. We are aware that we might need to go to the bathroom, things like that. When our sympathetic branch is dominant, our pupils dilate because we want to be able to take in everything from our environment. We want to be hyper aware. We can take big, fast breaths because we really are craving oxygen at that point. Our heart rate speeds up. But some of the naturally occurring processes like digestion kind of shut down, right? That's why we don't want to, I remember my mom used to always make us wait an hour after we ate before we went swimming, because we want that food to digest before we become very active. Because when we're super active and our muscles are contracting and more, digestion halts and we can end up with a tummy ache, right? And then glucose is being released into our bloodstream to give us extra energy and some other things like that when we're in fight or flight. Okay, so we want the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system to be dominant most of the time. Remember that for when we get into the strategies conversation. Okay, now I want to talk about some structures of the brain that we do not have labeled on your coloring page, but that I want you to be aware of, because a lot of our strategies will be assisting with building up or developing these structures that play a major role in self-regulation. And one of these is the insular cortex. It's sometimes just called the insula. The insular cortex is in the temporal lobe of the brain, and we are beginning to recognize that this is where interoception takes place. When I was in graduate school, we learned about 7 sensory systems, and now we're really learning about 8 sensory systems, and interoception is kind of the new kid on the block. We have to think it's always been there, but we labeled that in other sensory areas like tactile and possibly proprioception and more, and now we've given it its own heading. So interoception is perception of my bodily states. And this perception takes place in the insular cortex. So it is my awareness of what's going on internally. Like, is my heart beating fast? Does my stomach hurt? Do I need to go to the bathroom? Am I ill? Am I hot or cold? Am I hungry or thirsty? This is interoceptive awareness. And what we're realizing is that interoceptive awareness is the first phase of emotional identification. Somewhere along the line, I've learned that when my stomach feels kind of jittery and my muscles are tight, I'm scared or anxious. Sometimes when I just feel really heavy and slow inside, I'm sad, right? So I've learned to identify my emotions based on what's happening, based on physiological signs and symptoms. And that is what interoception is. Interoception largely takes place in the insular cortex of the brain. Now, through brain imaging, we are learning some really interesting things. I'm just kind of skimming over this slide, but it shows you all that goes into awareness, and that's what we're calling interoception. Okay, so in the insular cortex, through brain imaging, we see too much activity in this part of the brain in people with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And that makes sense, right? So think about the insular cortex as being the home of interoception. If too much activity is happening in this part of my brain, I'm over-assigning my body's responses. I'm kind of making a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak. So for example, if most of us right now, we're all kind of hyper aware of germs because of COVID. So if I'm at the grocery store and I see somebody cough in front of me, and then I go up to that checkout line, I may have to touch the keypad or something that cougher just touched. I may think, yuck, but I just kind of make a mental note to myself, don't touch my face. When I get to my car, I'll use hand sanitizer and so forth. But for a person with OCD who has too much going on in this part of the brain, where most of us register yuck, this person registers all out disgust because there's too much activity, where, they should be interpreting yuck, they're interpreting all out disgust. That is part of OCD. Think of it as making a mountain out of a molehill of those physiological responses. We see too little activity in the insular cortex in some people with major depressive disorder. Now, certainly there are forms of major depressive disorder that have to do with things that have happened in your past. But there are some people who experience major depressive disorder that cannot be accounted for by past trauma or grief and so forth. And that makes sense if we see that too little activity in the insular cortex. Too little means I'm not registering anything that's going on in my body. And if I'm not getting any feedback from my body, I could just feel really empty and hollow. And that could cause major depressive disorder. And then we also see too little activity in the insular cortex in people with autism spectrum disorder. And that also makes sense. These people, kids, have a very hard time identifying what's going on in their bodies. Therefore, they have a hard time identifying their own emotions. And if I can't identify my own emotions, it's next to impossible for me to figure out what you're thinking and feeling. Because I'm able to notice and observe what you're thinking and feeling based on facial expression and body language, and understanding what I kind of look like and feel like when I'm experiencing that emotion. So too little activity in this part of the brain makes it very difficult for our friends on the spectrum to identify their own emotions and therefore the emotions of others. So super interesting. By the way, if you have printed out your, I think I called it the NBT chart in your course materials section. I don't think it was there a little bit ago, but Celeste has texted me and said it is there now. So this is available on the course page, the one that says pre-sale. So it's the on-demand page. If you're watching this on demand, it's in the same section where you access your course materials. This is called the NBT chart. And this is just a place for you to start noting the brain differences that are often associated with these diagnoses. So for example, next to OCD and anxiety on this chart, which is at the bottom of the first page, I've noticed too much activity in the insula, and I've just drawn an arrow pointing up. So insula, too much activity. And then next to autism spectrum disorder, which is near the top, I've drawn an arrow down, too little activity in the insula. So I wrote insula and then too little activity. So that's how you could use this chart. That way later, when we start going through strategies and we see a strategy that improves processing in the insular cortex, you'll know, oh, that would work then for autism because there's too little activity in that area in kids with autism. Does that make sense? So you don't have to use this chart, but I like things like this, and it will help later when we start talking about strategies. You'll think, oh yeah, midline crossing activities should be good for kids with autism and kids with ADHD because most need help improving volume in the corpus callosum. Okay, so that's how you can use that chart if you choose to do so. So as we start looking at brain-based differences that are associated with certain diagnoses, that's where I would use this chart. I think what I'm going to do this week is go ahead and fill this chart out and make it available for you so that you can double check that you got it all. But I'm a learner that learns by doing, so I would still encourage you to go ahead and write these down as they come up. You can always print off a clean copy and copy mine if you'd like to later, but I would encourage you to make your own notes on these as you go through this, just as that for those kinesthetic learners, the people who learn through writing and through deciding where it goes, because this is a lot of hard material. And the more resources like this, the more ways that you see it, that you experience writing this information down, I feel like the more ingrained it will be in your head. So hopefully that's helpful for some of you. Okay. A few other things that I want you to know about the brain are what is the brain made of? And it's made of white matter and gray matter. And white matter is made of well, let's get back to white matter in a minute. Gray matter is made of the cell bodies. The neural cells all have three primary parts: the soma, or the cell body, and then dendrites that come off of that cell body that take in chemical messengers from connecting neurons. And then on the other, it's usually on the other side when we look at it on a diagram, it's a longer arm that's called the axon. And the axon passes on that neurotransmitter or neurochemical onto connecting neurons. So each neuron has those three parts: dendrites, the neural body or soma, the cell body, and the axon. Okay. So the gray matter is made up of the cell bodies, the neural bodies, or they're also called soma. That's gray matter. And then over time and with use, the axons get coated with this myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath serves as an insulator to allow that chemical messenger to be sent on more efficiently and effectively. So the more white matter we have, the more efficient and effective our brains are. The myelin is white, and so that makes up the white matter in the brain. So the gray matter is made up of the neural cell bodies, and the white matter is made up of the myelin sheath that surrounds the axons of those neurons. Okay? So we will see certain parts of the brain that are mostly made up of white matter and certain parts of the brain that are mostly made up of gray matter as we go through our conversations further. And then I also want you to be aware of brain waves, because we will talk about how some strategies enhance beta brain waves or alpha brain waves. So I want you to have a basic idea of the different brain waves. And we see different researchers break them down into 4 or 5 categories, depending on the researcher. But these are the primary 4 that we hear the most about. Beta is the highest frequency of brainwave on this chart. And beta indicates a state of concentration and arousal and alertness. The higher frequency, so when we get closer, it ranges from 14 to 30 hertz, but the closer to 30 we get, the more that we may be experiencing some same anxiety, a little bit of fight or flight. So we're concentrated, but we're kind of stressed. Research indicates that most of us professionals primarily live in beta. You know, we're concentrating, we're productive, but we're a little bit stressed out too. So we're probably toward that upper range of beta. Alpha is a little bit slower. It's in the 8 to 14 hertz brainwave frequency. And alpha, we're really focused and alert, but we're a little bit more relaxed. We can kind of get into super learning here. It can kind of be a light trance. I get into alpha sometimes. I work from home for a lot of my time, you know, writing new courses, things like that. And so I don't have a lot of distractions, and just kind of a funny or not so funny story that happened this winter. I was writing this course actually, and so I was totally absorbed in it because I'm a neuro geek. I love this, but it takes a lot of brain power, so I was thoroughly absorbed in it. I put on bean soup around noon, and that's what we were going to have for supper. So I mixed everything up, put it on the stove, and went back into my office. And I got into this super learning state in a light trance, right? I am hyper focused. And my daughter texted me from upstairs, because that's what 17-year-olds do sometimes. And she said, I smell something burning. And I instantly was like, I do too. Like, part of my brain had been aware that I smelled something burning, but I was so absorbed in what I was doing that I disregarded it. So that's not safe, right? I was a little bit too much in a trance, which isn't awesome, but funny. We pretty much had a soup fire, whatever that's called. I had to get it outside. It smoked forever, and our house reeked for about a month. I was a little worried. But that's just an example of what that can look like. So we want to be aware, but ideally we're going to be at that slower range of beta or higher range of alpha. That's where we're going to be the most productive, but not stressed. And then we move into the slower range of theta, where we are asleep, but we're active sleepers. That's usually the REM part of sleep, rapid eye movement, where we're dreaming. A lot of very important things happen while we're in theta sleep. It's where we process some emotions and process our feelings. And then delta is the very slowest brainwave frequency on this chart. And this is our dreamless sleep, which is also a very important dream stage. This is where human growth hormones are released and loss of body awareness, so it allows us access to our unconscious mind, and very important for processing thoughts and formation of memories and more. This chart shows one additional range, which is really higher frequency than beta, and gamma can be high performance, but some research also shows that it can be associated with stress too, just because it is a high frequency brainwave. So it's kind of, gamma's kind of a newer discovery. Some people can get into gamma brainwave through meditation, so they are actually relaxed but have access to higher level brain functions. And then some research shows that in people with cognitive impairments, they show very little gamma brainwave frequency. So it can be kind of confusing, because some research shows it's a stress thing, and others show we're more likely to get him through meditation. So I think it's just, there's a lot more to learn. But overall, we want to stay between alpha and beta, and that's where we want our kids at school to be primarily. So we're going to look at a lot of strategies that stimulate alpha and beta brainwave frequencies. Okay, we talked briefly about the structure of a neuron, and here's a cartoon picture of a neuron. So these little projections here are the dendrites that take in the chemical messenger from the connecting neuron. Where his face is, that would be the soma, or the cell body. And then this is the axon, the longer kind of leg of the neuron. And these little, this is the myelin coating that allows those chemical messengers to be sent efficiently. And these are the axon terminals that connect with other neurons to send the messenger on. And this is a little bit more scientific diagram of the neuron. There's a lot of important things that happen in the soma, or the cell body. This is where neurochemicals are produced, and also an action potential has to be reached in order for that message to be sent on down the road or down the line of connecting neurons. So the dendrites take in chemical messages, If enough comes in to reach that action potential, the message is sent on. If not enough is brought in to reach that action potential, then the message just kind of dies out at this point. Now, what we need for adequate neurotransmitter production primarily are amino acids, which are a very basic protein, and cofactors. Cofactors are things like magnesium, iron, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin B, and so forth. So we get the basics for neurochemical production through a well-balanced diet. Most of us do. Ideally, we get it through a well-balanced diet and through sunshine, the things that contribute those cofactors. So we're going to talk about that later near the end of our course, like 6 sessions from now, when we talk about what all goes into giving our brains what they need in order to be healthy. But for now, no, amino acids and cofactors are the basic building blocks for neurotransmitters. So, and then the myelin sheath gets added over time. Babies are born with very little white matter. And then this happens over time as these neural connections are used frequently. The myelin sheath becomes added to make it even more efficient and effective. And then the neurochemicals are sent across the synapse at the end of the axon terminals to be absorbed by a dendrite from another connecting neuron. And this is how the process works. And every chemical message, from memories to emotions to communicating that our muscles need to move, all of those processes happen through this same cycle of chemical messages being taken in, an action potential is reached, the message is sent on down the road to share that information with other brain structures or with muscles and body parts and more. So it's an amazing process, mind-boggling process, in fact. And there's a lot that can go wrong with this process as well. There are some conditions where you're born with too many dendrites or too few dendrites, which is going to change how chemical messages are treated and handled. And then you can be born with too little or too much of certain neurotransmitters, or predisposition for too little or too much. That can go wrong, or you may not be eating a well-balanced diet and you may not be getting enough sunshine, so you do not have enough of the cofactors or amino acids needed to produce sufficient levels of neurotransmitters. And then maybe you're not getting enough myelin coating or myelin sheath formation on your axons, so the messages aren't sent very effectively. And then things can go wrong at the synapse too. There can be differences in the transporter genes, and we're going to talk more about those kinds of things later. So sometimes the neurotransmitter just kind of dissipates and it doesn't reach its final destination effectively. There can be things that block the receptors on the connecting dendrite. So sometimes this is associated with certain diagnoses. Sometimes it has to do with drugs or medications that are being used, and sometimes it has to do with genetics. So we're going to look at the known differences associated with diagnoses. The difference between a nerve and a neuron is that a nerve is a bundle of neurons in general. Even more specifically, a nerve is primarily a bundle of axons. So remember, the axon is usually the longest part of a neuron. Some axons are very tiny, like the ones that are just in the brain, and some axons are long. Like we all have a soma, or a cell body, at the base of our spinal cord. And the axon coming off the cell body goes all the way to our little toe. So that axon is very long. Axons can be very short or very long, and nerves are typically bundles of axons that are all going in the same direction. Okay, now we're just going to kind of talk about some other things that you hear about when you start looking into neurological conditions and diagnoses. And mirror neurons are something that got a lot of attention. It was kind of a research craze in the 80s and 90s, but has kind of died out or dissipated. But still we see it show up in the research sometimes. And mirror neurons came from research. One primary experiment that happened in 1992 that showed that neurons in the brains of monkeys fired while those monkeys performed an action, like picking up a ball. And then they showed those same neurons fired when they saw somebody else picking up that ball. So the same part of the brain was active, whether the monkey actually was doing the action or whether he saw somebody else do the action. And then in 2000, another neuroscientist wrote an article that started a belief that mirror neurons underlie multiple aspects of psychology. And then from that research grew theories like the broken mirror theory that you maybe have heard about, that propose that autism is based in a deficiency in mirror neurons. And at first glance, that kind of made sense because people with autism do seem to not be imitating human expression and human actions and emotions the way that they're typically developing peers are. But only one study has really shown any evidence that neurons exist in the human brain with the properties of the mirror neurons seen in monkeys. And that study only showed premotor neuron firing. So it's mainly only applying to motor actions. We don't necessarily think that that explains lack of facial expression in people with autism or anything more at this point in time. But this information could be helpful at teaching motor skills, knowing that that's why it's important to allow somebody to observe a motor skill. That's why demonstration of a motor skill is helpful. So in general, most researchers believe that mirror neurons contribute to motor learning, but we don't have much evidence that it goes beyond that. So that may not be why people with autism have a hard time recognizing emotions, things like that. But there was one theory proposed, and that was the broken mirror theory. So you maybe have heard of that. Okay, also in our conversation about nerves, we do hear a fair amount about the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is what we feel is responsible for that brain-body connection, or the brain-gut connection we hear it referred to as sometimes. And we all know that to be true. Like if you're really stressed and frazzled, you feel it in your gut, don't you? It doesn't feel very good. Or if you're sick in your gut, it's hard for you to think straight because of this brain-gut connection. And the vagus nerve really is the brain-gut connection. It's the one that connects the two. And the vagus nerve is our 10th cranial nerve. Most nerves exit from our spinal cord, but we have 12 nerves that exit directly from our brains. Like the optic nerve and the auditory nerve and the olfactory nerve. Those are some of them that you may remember learning. I remember in graduate school, we used this mnemonic to learn about the 12 cranial nerves, and it was OOO, to touch and feel, vowels, green, vest, and hat. And those are the initials of the 12 cranial nerves. So we have olfactory, optic, ocular, motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, auditory, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal, accessory, and hypoglossal. So you don't need to know all those now, but just as a memory refresher for you. So the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. It comes directly off our brain, and then it wanders. In fact, the word vagus means to wander. It wanders to multiple organs throughout our body. So it's directly from our brain to our gut, to our organs, and that's the brain-gut connection, the vagus nerve. And it plays a role in several structures, like in the liver and the gut, and plays a role in inflammation and so forth. So it plays some pretty significant roles. And vagal tone helps to activate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. So vagal tone is a good thing. We want to stimulate the vagus nerve because that stimulation triggers the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system to take over. And remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest, feed and breathe. We want that to be dominant most of the time. When parasympathetic is dominant, it shuts down sympathetic, which is fight or flight. And we don't want to be in fight or flight unless we're actually in danger. Okay, I'm going to play just a portion of this video. Just kind of helps you see the big picture of the vagus nerve. I'm going to fast forward through a little of it and just show you a bit of it. She has a nice accent, so it's kind of fun to listen to.
The vagus nerve. Vega in Latin means to wander. This nerve wanders around the body, impacting major organs. This being the longest cranial nerve, it controls all involuntary body processes such as breathing, speech, swallowing, heartbeat, blood pressure, hearing, taste, circulation, digestion, and gut health. It also controls bladder movement, orgasms, and fertility. A healthy vagus nerve allows us to access the parts of the brain responsible for creativity, higher cognition, and complex decision making. In the absence of a healthy vagus nerve, we only end up having access to parts of our brain that control primal instincts like fear and fight or flight response. Hence, a healthy vagus nerve is essential for leadership and decision making. The functioning of the vagus nerve can be impaired by stress, anxiety, poor lifestyle, smoking, drinking alcohol, and overworking, lack of exercise, proper nutrition, and sleep. When the vagus nerve is not able to perform to the best of its ability, the body and mind become susceptible to a range of diseases like depression, anxiety, obesity, cardiovascular disorders, hypertension, diabetes, digestive disorders, chronic inflammation, kidney malfunction, infertility, and even Parkinson's.
Okay, I'm going to stop there on that video. And so it's interesting, and it plays a lot of roles in our body, and we want to think about strategies that stimulate the vagus nerve, because that triggers the parasympathetic branch, which is healthy. It's when the vagus nerve kind of shuts down that it allows fight or flight to take over and so forth. I did just see a question asking me to repeat the mnemonic for the cranial nerves, and I'm happy to do that. The mnemonic for that is O-O-O, to touch and feel vowels, green, vest, and hat. O-O-O, to touch and feel vowels, green, vest, and hat. Okay, that's a mnemonic for the 12 cranial nerves. Okay, so let's see, how much time do we have left? We are at the end of our session for today, and I just want to clarify a few things. I think earlier when I was showing you how to access the recordings, I had that on my second screen. Celeste just texted me to let me know that. I apologize for that. So I want to show you that again. We're going to leave off here on this slide, and we'll pick up at our next section. So let me exit out of my PowerPoint, and I'm going to drag my browser window down. So now you should be seeing, this is the view on demand page for this course. Right now it says pre-sale. It won't say pre-sale very much longer because we only leave it up that way until the first video is present. So yours probably won't say that by the time you get to this page. You can find this page from within your account. There's a link to it. Or you can go to Continuing Ed and then search for it under the view on demand webinars. It will help if you search by my name because it will limit the ones that you see. It's the same page where you purchased the course initially. If you go back to that page now, as long as you're logged in, this is where the video is hosted. So you'll go back to this page, and what you'll see is this is where today's video will be. Right now it's just a placeholder because we haven't uploaded yet. And then we have the different parts of the course materials. In fact, I think I need to refresh my screen real quick because Celeste added the NBT chart. It's still not showing up. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so these are the different, for today, we really just needed part 1 of our course manual. Next time, I would go ahead and print part 2 and 3 because I'm not sure how far we'll get. And then the brain coloring page is printable from here. The neurotransmitter chart you'll need when we get to the neurotransmitter section, which is probably next week. And then the NBT chart, this is the one where we're going to start tracking the known brain differences associated with some of the major diagnoses, the neurochemical differences, and then the strategies that should be useful based on research showing the brain structures that are improved, and then the references of the bibliography. And the multiple, we'll keep one video up here each time, but the other sections you can find directly on these YouTube links. And then here's where you'll find the course evaluation and post-test, but you won't need those until you complete all 6 segments of this course. So don't try to take the course eval or the test yet, okay? I appreciate those of you who are here live today. Feel free to ask me questions in the question box for those of you who are here live. If you're watching the on-demand version, feel free to shoot me an email, gwen@sensationalbrain.com, to let me know your questions. Let's see if there was anything else I wanted to tell you. I don't think so. I think for next time, make sure again you have your brain coloring page handy, and you might want to go back and review the recording and add the labels and some coloring to that page, and come back with this chart, and we're going to keep adding to that throughout the session. I will put a filled-in version of this chart available on the course resources page, but I think it will help you learn if you do it yourself first, and then you can go back and add to it or do it again later by copying mine. So any questions from those of you who are live, anything you wanted me to repeat? It looks like I'm getting some feedback that the videos were okay. Good, I hope that helps. And you can go back and watch them again through the YouTube links if you'd like, if they're helpful to you. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. For those of you who are here live or start watching the recordings, feel free to give me feedback by email. You're not going to be able to fill out the course evaluation until we complete the course, but if something isn't working very well for you, if you'd like me to slow down or anything like that, feel free to let me know so that I can correct that before our session 2. Okay? So I think that's it then. I'm not seeing any questions right now, so thank you for all of you who participated live. The video will be uploaded probably by the end of today, but definitely by tomorrow morning for you to go back and review, and make sure to print out more of the course handouts before next week. So I'll see you all again next week, same time, same place. Thanks so much for being here today. Okay, I see a participant saying that next week she will need to access the video the following day. Will it be best to access through the YouTube video? And the slides and videos were fantastic. Thank you. You're very welcome. For next week, yes, go back to this page and see. I'm not sure if we'll have, this will probably still be this week's video that's showing up here. And then if you scroll down, you'll see like session 2, this will become a hot link once we have it uploaded. You can just click directly there. You'll be taken directly to an unlisted YouTube page, and you can watch it right on YouTube, okay? That'll probably be the easiest way to do that. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me if anything comes up, and I'm happy to help you problem solve. And I'll see you all next week. Thank you all for being here today.